In England, many suffered persecution for their religious beliefs, not just the Pilgrims and Puritans. Around 1669, a unique religious sect emerged under the guidance of George Fox. They called themselves Friends, but others referred to them as Quakers. These people were punished severely for their religious ideas. Their central doctrine was that they were led in all things by the inner light, which they called conscience, revealing to them the will of God. The Quakers believed that all men were equal before the law, and as a sign of equality, they always kept their hats on in public places, even in the presence of royalty. They also refused to take an oath in court, go to war, or pay taxes to support war. They used thee and thou in addressing one another, and wore plain clothes of sober colors as a protest against the rich and elegant dress of their time. Their disdain for familiar customs made them appear eccentric, and their boldness of speech and action frequently brought punishment from the law. However, they were fearless in their defiance, and even eager to suffer for their religious beliefs. Some were fined, some cast into prison, some whipped, and some put to death. In Massachusetts, they were treated like criminals, and the Puritan fathers hated and feared them so much that they banished Quakers from their colony and put some of them to death for their views on religion and government. But as always, persecution only seemed to spread the faith, and soon this derided and abused sect included eminent converts. One of the most prominent converts was William Penn, born in London in 1644, the son of Sir William Penn, a wealthy admiral in the British Navy. Sir William had won great esteem at court for his conspicuous service to his country, and he naturally desired to give his son the best possible advantages. At the tender age of 16, young William was dispatched to Oxford, where his diligent habits and academic prowess quickly set him apart. He became well versed in Greek and Latin, and mastered the modern tongues of French, German, Italian, and Dutch with ease. While he did devote some of his time to athletics, he also became a skilled oarsman and a leader in various outdoor sports. During his time at Oxford, Penn heard Thomas Lowe, a traveling Quaker, preach. The new doctrines, as expounded by Lowe, took such a profound hold on him that he refused to attend the religious services of his college. For this breach of protocol, he was fined, along with some of his like-minded companions. Undeterred, these conscientious young men even refused to wear the required college gown, and committed an even more serious offense against their college by tearing off the gowns from some of their fellow students. As a result of these bold and unruly actions, the college authorities expelled Penn in disgrace. His father was incensed by what he deemed his son's foolishness, and knowing that neither rebuke nor persuasion was likely to sway the young man from his purpose, Admiral Penn decided to send William to Paris, hoping that the gay life of the French capital might distract him from his Quaker ideas. Penn was now a strapping young man of 18, with large eyes and long, dark curls cascading down his shoulders. For a brief spell, he indulged in the fashionable social scene of Paris. Later, he spent a year studying, followed by another year traveling through France and Italy. Upon his return to England after 2 years' absence, he was a cultured young gentleman, vastly different from the somber youth who, upon leaving Oxford, had been dubbed a Quaker, or some other melancholy thing by his peers. However, the following year, Penn's jovial spirits were dampened by the dreadful plague that ravaged London. Observing the gravity of his son's demeanor, the admiral once again sent him away, this time to Ireland for some diversion. While in Ireland, an insurrection broke out, and Penn volunteered as a soldier. Military life evidently appealed to him, as he had a portrait of himself painted in full armor. As a soldier, William Penn heard that the Quaker, Thomas Lowe, was preaching nearby and went to hear him once more. The Quaker ideas now took complete possession of him, and he embraced the new religion with his whole heart. A little later, when he was arrested in a Quaker meeting-house and thrown into prison, his father was indignant because William had brought upon his family such humiliating disgrace. After William's release from prison, however, the stern old admiral, in his great love for his son, said he would forgive his peculiar customs if only he would remove his hat to his father, to the king, or the Duke of York. But on praying over the matter, Penn said he could not do it. One day, on meeting the king, he had the boldness to stand with his hat on in the royal presence. Instead of getting angry, the fun-loving King Charles laughed and took off his own hat. "Why do you remove your hat, friend Charles?" said William Penn. "Because," answered the king, "wherever I am it is customary for one to remain uncovered." But the admiral's patience was by this time exhausted. He drove his wilful son from his presence and told him to be gone for all time. Fortunately for William, his mother begged for him, and so did others who recognized the earnest and sincere purpose of the young Quaker. His father, therefore, forgave him once more and allowed him to return home. From this time on, William Penn used his influence, which was by no means small, in behalf of the persecuted Quakers. But he had to suffer the consequences of his own fearlessness. Many times was he thrown into prison, there to remain, it might be, for months. Yet even in prison, he spent his time writing books and pamphlets, explaining and defending the Quaker religion. Indeed, his labors were unceasing. So firm was his faith in Quaker ideas. Soon his power for doing good was immensely increased. In 1670 his father died, and left him a princely fortune which, true to his generous nature, he determined to use for the good of others, and especially for the good of the despised and persecuted Quakers. The crown owed Penn's father around £16,000, which the king, with his extravagant habits, was not likely to pay for many a day. William Penn, therefore, decided to ask the king to pay the debt, not in money, but in land. The good-natured Charles, thinking this was an easy way to cancel the obligation, readily granted to William Penn an extensive tract of land lying on the west side of the Delaware River. Penn wished his new possession to be called Sylvania, or Woodland, but the king insisted upon calling it Pennsylvania, in honor of Penn's father. Upon receiving his grant, Penn at once sent word to the Quakers that in Pennsylvania they could find a home and a resting place from their troubles. Penn's leading aim was to plant a self-governing colony, whose people should have justice and religious freedom. Hundreds of Quakers eagerly took advantage of the favorable opportunity which Penn thus offered to them. During the year 1681, when the first settlement was planted in Pennsylvania, something like 3,000 of them sailed for the Delaware River. The next year Penn himself sailed for America, although he left his wife and children behind. He selected the junction of the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers as the site for his city, and called it Philadelphia, or the city of brotherly love, in token of the spirit which he hoped might prevail throughout his colony. He laid out the city most carefully, giving the streets such names as Pine, Cedar, Mulberry, Walnut, and Chestnut, after the trees he found growing there. When the first settlers came to Philadelphia, some of them lived in caves which they dug in the high river banks. The first houses, built of logs, were very simple, containing only 2 rooms, and having no floor except the earth. Philadelphia grew so fast, however, that by 1684 it had 357 houses, many of which were 3 stories high, with cellars and balconies. As we might expect from a man of his even temper and unselfish spirit, Penn treated the Indians with kindness and justice, and won their friendship from the first. Although he held the land by a grant from the King of England, still he wished to satisfy the natives by paying them for their claims to the land. Accordingly, he called a council under the spreading branches of a now famous elm tree, where he met the red men as friends, giving them knives, kettles, axes, beads, and various other things in exchange for the land. He proclaimed that he shared the same flesh and blood as the indigenous people, and they, in turn, declared that they would live in harmony with William Penn for as long as the sun and moon shone. Penn made friendly visits to the Native Americans, partaking in their roasted acorns and hominy, and joining in their games. One day, while they were leaping and jumping in his presence, he suddenly sprang up and beat them all. Penn eventually returned to England, but many years later, in 1699, he returned to Pennsylvania with his wife and daughter. Being quite wealthy, he had 2 homes, one in the city and another in the countryside. His country home, located northeast of the city on the Delaware River, cost him $35,000. The house was adorned with elegant furnishings, and in his large dining hall Penn lavishly entertained Englishmen, Swedes, Native Americans, sharecroppers, and passing strangers who called at his door. It is said that his table was so bountiful that during one of his feasts the guests ate 100 roasted turkeys. The grounds surrounding his country home were magnificent, containing various fruits and flowers, and his stables housed many horses. Despite these material blessings, Penn's life was not without trials and disappointments, which need not be dwelled upon. Due to his warm friendship with King James, he was suspected of plotting in his favor after the king was forced to leave England in 1688. He was arrested more than once, but in every case he was set free for lack of evidence against him. Many years later, when he refused to pay a false claim made by his steward, he was thrown into prison, where his health was broken by confinement. He died in 1718. His life had been a hard struggle, but it had been successful and had come to an honorable close. Chapter 9. Cavalier de La Salle and the French in the Mississippi Valley. In the same year that William Penn founded Philadelphia and made peace with the Indians, a renowned Frenchman sailed down the Mississippi River, exploring it on behalf of France. This man was Robert Cavelier, also known as La Salle, who, like many of his countrymen, sought to achieve something in America that would bring glory to his name and honor to his homeland. Now, we must examine the French presence in America. In 1534, a French explorer named Cartier discovered the St. Lawrence River and sailed up to an Indian village on the site of present-day Montreal. He claimed Canada for the French king, and his favorable reports led to several unsuccessful attempts to establish settlements there. More than 70 years later, another French explorer named Samuel de Champlain sailed up the magnificent river. He was greatly impressed by the beauty of the St. Lawrence Valley and its abundance of forests and firs, and he longed to bring this vast new country under French control. In 1608, he founded the first permanent French settlement in Canada at Quebec, and the following year, he discovered the lake that bears his name. Although Champlain loved his country and sought to increase its glory and power, he made a grave mistake that proved fatal to France's best interests in the New World. In 1608, when he founded the settlement at Quebec, he discovered that the neighboring Algonquin Indians were bitter enemies of the Mohawks, one of the 5 nations, or Iroquois, who lived in New York. The Algonquins implored Champlain to join them in attacking the Mohawks, and he foolishly agreed. He led a party of 60 Indians up Lake Champlain and landed near Ticonderoga to engage in battle with 200 Mohawk warriors. Champlain, wearing light armor and armed with a gun, advanced at the head of his war party and shot 2 of the Mohawk chiefs, causing the others to flee in terror and confusion. Champlain's Indian allies cheered and filled the woods with their fearsome war cries. From that fateful day, the Iroquois became the implacable foes of the French, and their animosity seriously impeded the successful execution of French designs. With dominion over the St. Lawrence River, France coveted control of the Mississippi River as well. By securing possession of these 2 mighty streams, she would command the riches of the North American continent. However, the Iroquois Indians were entrenched in the Mohawk River Valley and thus held the key to the situation. They obstructed the path of the French, who sought to reach Ohio and the Mississippi via Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Consequently, the French were compelled to seek a more northerly route, a path that was much longer and more arduous. This circuitous way extended up the Ottawa River into Georgian Bay, through Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, across into the Illinois River, and through that into the Mississippi. In the same year that Champlain made the Iroquois bitter enemies of the French, Henry Hudson won their enduring friendship with the Dutch. Around the time the Frenchman was battling the Mohawks at Ticonderoga, Hudson, with a crew of 20 men aboard the Half Moon, was navigating the river that now bears his name. Instead of discovering the short passage to the Pacific, which he was seeking in the interests of the Dutch, he stumbled upon the great waterway to the interior. Having been treated justly by him, the Iroquois Indians became his allies, and the allies of the Dutch settlers and traders who followed. From that moment on, these Iroquois Indians were as willing to vend their pelts to the Dutch and the English, who wrested New York from the Dutch in 1664, as they were to oppose the French and forced them to travel many hundreds of miles out of their way in their tedious explorations for the Mississippi. The Jesuit missionaries were brave explorers who accomplished the toilsome work of exploration. They fearlessly advanced their faith, enduring all sorts of hardships, including death, in their earnest struggle to bring religious truth to the ignorant red men of the woods. These Jesuit fathers made many valuable discoveries and explorations during their journeys through the forests and over the lakes, which they carefully recorded in their journals. One of these missionaries, Father Marquette, succeeded in reaching the waters of the Mississippi. Accompanied by Joliet and 5 other Frenchmen, he traveled as far down the mighty river as the mouth of Arkansas in 1673. This was 65 years after Champlain made his settlement in Quebec. However, the most important of all the French explorations was made by the daring and tireless La Salle. Born in France in 1643, La Salle belonged to an old and rich family. He was strong in mind and character, received a good education, and became an earnest Catholic. With a heart ready to brave any danger in the achievement of glory for himself and for France, this young man sailed for Canada at the age of 23. La Salle's plans were twofold. 1. To build forts and trading centers at various points along St. Lawrence, the Great Lakes, and the Mississippi, and 2. To plant a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi. His forts and colony would help to protect and further the rich fur trade for France, which could be carried on more easily by way of the Mississippi than by way of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence. The latter route lay the hostile Iroquois, who were friendly to the Dutch and the English. Moreover, St. Lawrence River was ice-bound for nearly half of the year. In August 1679, after long and weary efforts spent in preparation, La Salle launched his little vessel, the Griffin, of 40 tons burden, on the Niagara River above the falls. The Griffin was to bear him through the lakes on his way to the Mississippi. Nearly a year prior to his journey, La Salle had dispatched 15 men to the lakes to trade for furs. He anticipated their return with a cargo of furs to be sold in Canada, providing him with the necessary funds to purchase provisions, ammunition, and tools, and to pay his men. Additionally, he sought cables, anchors, and rigging for a new vessel to be constructed on the Illinois River, in preparation for his expedition to the mouth of the Mississippi. Upon reaching the head of Lake Huron, La Salle gathered the cargo and loaded the Griffin with furs. On September the 18th, 1679, he sent the vessel, manned by 6 men, to Niagara. La Salle continued his journey to the mouth of the St. Joseph River, where he constructed a fort and awaited the Griffin's return. However, the vessel never arrived, causing great loss and disappointment. After waiting for some time, La Salle proceeded with 8 canoes and a party of 33 men, rowing up the St. Joseph in search of the carrying place leading to the headwaters of the Illinois River. Upon landing, La Salle ventured alone to locate the pathway. In the midst of a blinding snowstorm, he lost his bearings in the dense forest, wandering until approximately 2 o'clock in the morning. Eventually, he found himself back at the river and fired his gun as a signal to the party. His eyes beheld a welcome sight, a fire ablaze in the woods. Believing he was near his comrades, he hastened his pace, only to discover his error. Near the fire, beneath a tree, lay a bed of dried grass, still warm, indicating that a man had recently been there. It was likely an Indian, frightened off by the sound of his gun. La Salle carefully arranged brush as a barricade on either side of the bed, then rested by the fire until daybreak. He did not reunite with his companions until 4 o'clock the following afternoon. Upon rejoining his party, they journeyed down the Illinois River until they came upon Indian wigwams on the forested bank. The Indians, hospitable and friendly, urged La Salle not to venture down the Mississippi. They spoke of the dangers of the journey so convincingly that 6 of La Salle's followers deserted, and another attempted to poison him. These were trying times for La Salle, as all his days were fraught with difficulties and perils. To protect himself from attack during the winter, he planned the construction of a fort, which he named Crèvecoeur, the French term for heartbreak, a fitting name indeed. Until this point, the resolute La Salle had not abandoned hope of hearing from the Griffin, but he now concluded that his vessel was lost. He had but one recourse, an overland journey of 1,500 miles to Canada to procure supplies for his Mississippi expedition. It was a perilous undertaking. Nevertheless, on March the 1st, 1680, accompanied by an Indian hunter and 4 Frenchmen, the intrepid explorer embarked on 2 canoes. The season was the worst possible for such an expedition. The ground was covered with melting snow, and the rivers in many places were frozen with ice too thick to be broken by the boats. Much of the time, the party had to pull the canoes on rough sleds overland, or carry them on their shoulders. A few days after setting out, they concealed the canoes in the woods, and continued on foot to the head of Lake Michigan. Reaching that point, it became necessary for them to navigate their arduous path through the dense forests of southern Michigan to the head of Lake Erie. For 3 days, the undergrowth was so thick with thorns that it shredded their clothing and scratched their faces until they bled. Another 3 days were spent wading through the flood-covered marshes, sometimes up to their waists in mud and water. At night, they would strip off their clothes and cover their bodies with blankets, lying down to sleep on dry hillocks. One frosty night, their clothes froze so stiff that they had to be thawed by the fireside before they could be put on. Amid such exposure, some of the men fell ill, delaying the party. But early in May, after 65 days, they reached Canada. As soon as he could settle his affairs in Canada, La Salle returned to the Illinois River and reached its mouth. But due to fresh disappointments, he had to make yet another journey through the wilderness to the base of his supplies on the St. Lawrence. Not until February the 6th, 1682, 2.5 years after he first set out in the Griffin, and after 3 attempts to build a suitable vessel for the journey, did he finally float out upon the waters of the Mississippi to explore it. And at last, he was obliged to make the journey in canoes. This time, his party included 54 people, 18 Indian warriors, 10 squaws, 3 Indian children, and 23 Frenchmen. Upon reaching the mouth of the river, he erected a column bearing the arms of France. With imposing ceremonies, he took possession of the great Mississippi Valley in the name of the French king, Louis XIV, after whom he named the country Louisiana. By constructing forts and trading centers along his route, La Salle accomplished the first part of his plan. He now resolved to go to France and recruit men for a colony he wished to establish at the mouth of the Mississippi, thus fulfilling the second part. In the year of our Lord 1684, having accomplished the arduous task of equipping this colony in France, he set sail with a fleet of 4 vessels in early July, seeking the mighty Mississippi River by way of the Gulf of Mexico. Alas, his fortune was not with him, for he missed the river's mouth, and instead landed at Matagorda Bay, a distance of 400 miles to the west. Thus began a series of misfortunes, including the loss of ships and supplies, scarcity of food, illness, death, and attacks by hostile natives. For 2 long years the pitiful colony struggled to survive. La Salle himself was in dire straits, for he knew that many of his men were his enemies, eager to take his life. He hoped for aid from France, but none came. It became clear to him that the only way to save the suffering colony was to make his way to Canada. And so, on January the 12th, 1687, he set out with a party of 17 men and 5 horses on another perilous journey, this time through the dense forests from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. Their journey northward took them across the Brazos River and onward to the Trinity River. But La Salle's men were weary of the endless trek through the woods, and some of them thirsted for his blood. They awaited only the right moment to carry out their murderous plan. On the morning of March the 19th, they lay in wait and shot him down as he approached, likely not far from the Trinity River. La Salle's life was one of tempest and danger, but he was as brave as a lion. Driven by ambition for himself and his country, he had little room in his life for anything else. His repeated failures brought criticism and loss of confidence from those who had lent him large sums of money, and these criticisms only hardened his spirit. With many enemies and growing suspicion, he seemed to lose sympathy for his men and became harsh in his treatment of them. But he accomplished great things for France, and his work entitles him to be counted among the most remarkable of all the explorers of America. Chapter 10. George Washington, the Boy Surveyor and Young Soldier. In the early days of exploration along the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, La Salle was a trailblazer for France. He had a grand vision of establishing a French empire in the vast and fertile territory, but his dreams were never fully realized. The French king was hesitant to send too many of his subjects to America, fearing it would weaken his own country. This missed opportunity was later seized by the English settlers who ventured westward across the Allegheny Mountains, leading to a struggle between the two nations. It's worth noting that Champlain settled Quebec for the French just 2 years after John Smith arrived in Jamestown. French explorers, priests, and traders gradually made their way into the heart of the continent via the Great Lakes, culminating in La Salle's claim of the Mississippi River in the name of the French king in 1681. This was over 50 years before the youngest of the 13 original colonies, Georgia, was established. In 1732, just 1 year before the settlement of Georgia, George Washington was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He would go on to play a significant role in the history of not only the Ohio and Mississippi valleys, but the entire country. His family lived on Bridges Creek Plantation near the Potomac River, in a 4-room farmhouse with a sloping roof attic and large brick chimneys at each end. George's father was a wealthy planter with land in 4 counties, including property near the Rappahannock River, where he invested in iron mines. When George was 7 years old, the family moved to a new home opposite the small village of Fredericksburg. He was sent to a small school, where a man named Hobby, a sexton of the church and tenant of George's father, taught him. The boy received a simple sort of training from such a schoolmaster. He learned a little reading, writing, and arithmetic, but that was about all. Later in life he became a fairly good penman, writing a neat round hand, but he never became a good speller. When George was 11 years old, his father died, leaving him the home where they lived on the Rappahannock, and his brother Lawrence the great plantation on the Potomac, later called Mount Vernon. Lawrence went to live at Mount Vernon, while George remained with his mother at the house opposite Fredericksburg. Now left without a father, George received his home training from his mother. Fortunate indeed was he to have such a mother to teach him, for she was kind, firm, and had a strong practical sense. She loved her son, and he deeply appreciated her fond care of him. Some of George's youthful letters to his mother are full of interest. After the manner of the time, he addressed her formally as "Honored Madam," and signed himself, "Your dutiful son." Nor was his mother the only strong and wholesome influence over his home life. His eldest brother, Lawrence, played an important part in shaping his character. According to the custom of those days, Lawrence, as the eldest son of a Virginia planter, would inherit the bulk of his father's estate. He was therefore sent to an excellent school in England to receive the training that would fit him to be a gentleman and a leader in social life. Learning was not held in such high esteem as the ability to look after the business of a large plantation and take a leading part in the public life of the county and the colony. With such training, Lawrence returned from England, a young man of culture and fine manners, well fitted to be a man of affairs. From this time on, George, now only 7 or 8 years old, looked up to his brother, 14 years his senior, with cordial admiration. Lawrence became George's model of manhood, and returned his younger brother's devotion with a tender love. After his father's passing, the lad went to live with his brother Augustine on the Bridges Creek plantation, seeking the benefits of a fine school. Many of his copybooks and exercises containing legal forms such as receipts, bills, and deeds, as well as depictions of birds and faces, have been preserved. These books also contain his codes of conduct, maxims that he kept before him as aids to good behavior. Here are a few of them. Every action in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those present. When a man does all he can, though it succeeds not well, blame not him that did it. Undertake not what you cannot perform, but be careful to keep your promise. Speak not evil of the absent, for it is unjust. Labor to keep alive in your breast that little spark of celestial fire called conscience. During George's school days, he heard many tales of wars with the Indians, and troubles between the English and French colonies. Furthermore, His brother Lawrence had been a soldier in the West Indies during a war between England and Spain, from which he had returned full of enthusiasm about what he had felt and seen. It was during this time that Lawrence renamed his plantation on the Potomac to Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Vernon, under whose command he had fought. Inspired by his brother's military spirit, George organized his friends into small military companies, and as their commander, drilled them, paraded them, and led them in their mock battles in the schoolyard. Naturally, the boys looked up to him as their leader, for he was strong in mind and body, and fond of athletic sports. It is said that no boy his age could match his running, jumping, wrestling, and pitching quoits. His athletic prowess also manifested in his fearless horsemanship. The story goes that he once mounted a colt that had successfully resisted all attempts to remain on his back. And so it was that George held on tight, his young body straining to stay atop the wild beast beneath him. The horse bucked and reared, desperate to throw off its persistent rider. But George was determined, his enjoyment of such spirited animals and the freedom of the hunt lasting well into his later years. But George was not just a skilled outdoorsman. He was a man of character, honest and fair-minded. His peers trusted him to settle their disputes, and he was known for his stout heart and truthfulness. Of course, he was not perfect. Like many of us, he struggled with a quick temper that was often hard to control. The quiet life of a Virginia plantation was not enough for this restless boy. He longed for adventure, having heard tales from his brother Lawrence of life on a warship, and having seen the ships that carried tobacco to England and brought back goods for the plantation. At 14, he packed his bags and made plans to become a sailor, but his mother convinced him to stay. Returning to school, George continued to excel in his studies, taking to heart the motto, "Whatever is worth doing at all is worth doing well." He was methodical and careful, traits that would serve him well in his future endeavors. His love of the outdoors led him to the study of surveying, and he applied himself diligently. Soon he was proficient enough to be trusted as a surveyor, a skill that would prove invaluable in his later life. In the autumn of his 16th year, he ventured to live with his brother Lawrence on the Mount Vernon plantation, where he spent much of his time surveying. It was here that he met a man who would greatly influence his future. This man was Lord Fairfax, a tall, courtly, white-haired English gentleman of about 60 years of age, who resided at Belvoir, a large plantation a few miles from Mount Vernon. At this time, George was a shy, awkward youth, somewhat overgrown for his age, with long arms and a tall, large frame. However, his serious face displayed a sign of quiet self-control and firm purpose. Despite their age and experience differences, the provincial youth of 15 and the cultured English lord of 60 became close friends. They spent much time together, sometimes surveying in the morning and going fox hunting in the afternoon. They undoubtedly conversed freely, and as Lord Fairfax had seen much of the best English life and had read some of the best English books, he was an interesting companion to his earnest and thoughtful young friend. Their warm friendship soon turned practical. Lord Fairfax owned an immense tract of country in the Shenandoah Valley, which some said was as much as 1/5 of the present state of Virginia. Wishing to learn more about it, and observing George to be exceedingly careful and accurate in his surveying, he decided to send him over the Blue Ridge into the wild region to find out and report to him something about the lands there. George was to have only one companion, George William Fairfax, who was the eldest son of Lord Fairfax's cousin, and was then about 22 years old. About the middle of March, 1748, when George Washington was barely 16 years old, these two young fellows set out together on horseback to travel through the forest a distance of 100 miles before they reached the Shenandoah Valley. They carried guns in their hands, for until their return about a month later, they would have to depend mainly upon hunting for their supply of food. The account which George himself has left enables us to picture them riding alone through the forest with no road except perhaps, at times, a path made by Indians or wild animals. After venturing into the untamed wilderness, they were forced to live in the most primitive manner. For example, Washington recounts a night spent in a woodcutter's cabin, where he had nothing but a mat of straw for a bed and a single blanket teeming with vermin for cover. In his diary he wrote, "I vowed to never sleep like that again, choosing instead to sleep in the open air by the fire. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "I've only slept in a bed 3 or 4 times. After walking all day, I've slept on a little hay, straw, fodder, or a bearskin with the family, like dogs and cats. The person closest to the fire is the happiest." Occasionally they attempted to live in a tent. During one storm the tent was blown over, and on another occasion the smoke from the fire forced them outside. One night, according to the same diary, "We camped in the woods, pitched our tent, and made a large fire. We pulled out our knapsacks to eat. Everyone cooked for themselves. Our spits were forked sticks, and our plates were large chips. They had no bread and drank only pure water from streams. On another occasion, they encountered a war party of painted warriors, whom Washington and his friend Fairfax fearlessly joined. They gathered around a massive fire built under the trees. As the great logs blazed in the midst of the dark forest, the Indians engaged in one of their wild, eerie dances. They leaped and whooped like madmen, while one of their companions pounded on a drum made by stretching a deerskin over a pot filled with water, and another shook a gourd filled with shot and adorned with a horse's tail to make it look fancy. It was a peculiar experience that these 2 young men had during that month. But Washington was well compensated, earning anywhere from $7 to $21 a day. When the young surveyor returned to Mount Vernon, his employer, Lord Fairfax, was so impressed with his report that he secured his appointment as a public surveyor. For the next 3 years, George lived the life of a surveyor, spending much of his time with Lord Fairfax at his wilderness home, Greenway Court, not far from Winchester. During this time George was gaining valuable knowledge of the forest, and becoming so familiar with Indian life that, as people said, he began to walk like an Indian. His life in the woods developed fearlessness, patience, and self-reliance, qualities which, combined with his ability and character, inspired men's confidence and established his leadership. Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia appointed him an officer in the state militia, with the rank of major. And as an officer, his influence continued to grow. About 2 years later, his brother Lawrence passed away and left the Mount Vernon estate to his daughter, with George Washington as her guardian. Upon her death, Washington became the owner of the vast plantation at Mount Vernon, and therefore a wealthy man. Fortune had smiled upon him, and he could have chosen to lead a life of leisure, but events soon occurred that called upon all of his heroic qualities. The conflict between the English and the French for control of the Ohio and Mississippi valleys was quickly escalating towards war. The French had long considered this territory their own. We remember that La Salle had explored it and attempted to establish colonies here. For many years, French explorers, priests, and traders had worked tirelessly, patiently pushing their way through the forests and establishing stronghold after stronghold. Eventually they began building forts between Lake Erie and the head of the Ohio Valley, pressing closer to the English border. The English also had their sights set on the fertile valley of the Ohio and were beginning to occupy it. Immediately, a company made up mostly of Virginia planters was formed to settle in the Ohio Valley. However, before they could do much, the French had boldly advanced far into territory claimed by England. The people of Virginia were in a state of alarm, wondering what the plans of the French were, and how many of them were already in the forts between Lake Erie and the Ohio River. Governor Dinwiddie and other Virginia gentlemen grew excited and decided to send a trusty messenger to the French commander in the fort near Lake Erie. The messenger was to ask by what right the French were invading a country belonging to England, find out about the French forces in the area, and make an effort to win over the Indians to the English side. George Washington, only 21 years old at the time, was chosen for this dangerous mission. On October the 30th, 1753, George Washington set out from Williamsburg with 7 companions, including an Indian and a French interpreter. They stopped at Fredericksburg to bid farewell to Washington's mother, and then continued on to Winchester, where they gathered supplies for their journey. From Winchester, they moved forward to Cumberland, Maryland, and then plunged boldly into the forest. The 1,000 mile through trackless forests in the bitter cold of winter was not an easy one. They faced overwhelming difficulties, including climbing lofty mountains and swimming in rivers swollen by heavy rains. but they persevered and eventually reached their destination. After receiving an answer from the French commander, who promised nothing, Washington started back home. The horses soon proved too weak to make much headway through the dense forests and deep snow, so Washington decided to push on without them. He left behind all of his party except a trusty woodsman and put on an Indian costume with a heavy cloak drawn over it. He strapped his pack containing his papers onto his back and, gun in hand, started off. A little later, they were joined by an Indian guide who turned out to be treacherous and suddenly turned and discharged his gun at Washington. Washington narrowly escaped death once again. He had planned to cross the Allegheny River on the ice, but was dismayed to find it broken up and filled with whirling blocks. He and his companion had to make a raft with a single hatchet. After finishing it, they pushed off and began a desperate struggle with the current and large blocks of floating ice. Washington was thrown violently into the water while trying to guide the raft with a pole. He caught hold of one of the raft logs and recovered himself, then reached a nearby island where they suffered through a night of intense cold without daring to kindle a fire for fear of Indians. On January the 16th, they reached Williamsburg, where Washington delivered the unsatisfactory letter he had brought from the French commander to Governor Dinwiddie. Although the expedition did not yield the desired result, Washington was highly praised for his effort in carrying out his perilous mission. The French commander's defiant answer made it seem probable to the people of Virginia that war would follow. A company of men was sent out to build a fort at the place where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers unite to form the Ohio. Washington had noted the importance of this site, later known as the Gateway of the West. Meanwhile, Washington drilled men for service, and in April set out with the rank of lieutenant colonel with 2 companies for the frontier. He learned that the French had driven off the men who had been sent to build a fort at the head of the Ohio with a large force, but he continued his march. When a small body of French was reported, the Virginians surprised them, killing, wounding, or capturing all but one. Colonel Washington was in the thickest of the fight, and wrote in a letter, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." After the skirmish that ignited the war, Washington made his way back to Great Meadows. Upon learning that a sizable French force was marching towards him, he hastily constructed crude earthworks, which he dubbed Fort Necessity. When the French attacked with 2 or 3 times his numbers, the valiant young colonel did not falter. For 9 hours, in a torrential downpour, he and his resolute followers stood their ground in the trenches, submerged up to their knees in mud and water. Despite being vastly outnumbered, his troops were ultimately defeated, but the House of Burgesses commended their commander for his bravery. The war now raged on in earnest, and England promptly dispatched troops under the command of General Braddock. Upon arriving in Virginia, Braddock appointed Colonel Washington to his staff. However, Washington soon realized that Braddock was ill-suited to lead an army in woodland warfare. Although he was willing to offer advice, the haughty British general refused to take suggestions from a colonial officer. With a force of 2,000 soldiers, General Braddock marched towards the French stationed at Fort Duquesne at the head of the Ohio River. On the morning of July the 9th, when the army was only 8 miles from the fort, it was suddenly ambushed by the French and their Indian allies, who lay in wait in the dense forest. The English soldiers, standing in tight formations, were picked off by squads, but the Virginians fought from behind trees in the true Indian fashion. Braddock, who was rightly described as a gallant bulldog, frantically rode back and forth, issuing orders to his men, but to no avail. He was soon thrown from his horse, mortally wounded. Colonel Washington, a conspicuous target for the enemy's guns, miraculously escaped injury despite 2 horses being shot out from under him and 4 bullets tearing through his clothing. The outcome was a crushing defeat for the English army, which lost 700 men out of 2,000 and 3/4 of its officers. Retreat was the only option. The brave yet narrow-minded Braddock had made a colossal and costly blunder. After the crushing defeat of Braddock, George Washington was entrusted with the command of the Virginia troops. In due course, he led an expedition against Fort Duquesne, just as Braddock had done before him. However, upon hearing of his approach, the French fled in terror. With the war having subsided in the Ohio Valley, Washington resigned his commission, returned to Mount Vernon, and soon thereafter married Mrs. Martha Custis, a wealthy young widow. We first encountered him as a strapping young lad, then as a dauntless frontiersman, and later as a valiant soldier. For now we shall leave him at Mount Vernon, where he became equally renowned as a refined gentleman in the cultured society of Old Virginia. Chapter 11. James Wolfe, the hero of Quebec. In the struggle for control of the Ohio Valley, the English and French fought fiercely. But the conflict of the last French war extended beyond this region. Many battles were waged to secure control of two vital waterways, the route to Canada, including Lakes George and Champlain, and the St. Lawrence River. The crowning achievement of the last French war was the valiant effort of a young English general to capture Quebec. This young general was James Wolfe, born in 1727 in southeastern England. His father, an officer in the English army, instilled in him a love for the soldier's life. Despite the trials and dangers he faced in his short and tumultuous career, he remained a devoted son, with a particularly tender and sincere love for his mother. He corresponded with her regularly, expressing his deepest thoughts and feelings. At the age of 16, he was sent to Flanders as an adjutant in an English army regiment. Through faithful and thorough work, he earned promotion, and soon, through bravery and skill, was appointed brigadier general. At 32, he was dispatched to America to assist in an expedition to Louisbourg, where he played a significant role in the stronghold's capture. Wolfe was an awkward figure, tall and slender with long limbs, narrow shoulders and red hair tied in a queue behind. His face was plain, with a receding chin and forehead and an upturned nose. But his keen, bright eyes, full of energy and fearlessness, gave him an attractive countenance and revealed his heroic nature. Despite his delicate health as a child and frequent bouts of illness as a youth, his resolute will and high ideals enabled him to achieve what others of a different mold would never have attempted. His most striking trait was an overmastering sense of duty that governed his actions. In his impatience he could be trying, but his tenderness and frankness easily won him enduring friendships. His soldiers adored him so much that they were willing to follow him through any danger to victory or death. After the capture of Louisbourg, Wolfe was so exhausted that he returned to England and sought treatment in Bath. It was there that he met Miss Catherine Lowther, and they soon became engaged. But his country needed him, and the great William Pitt saw in this fearless young general a fitting leader for a dangerous and difficult expedition against Quebec, the strongest and most important position held by the French in America. The French army at Quebec, commanded by General Montcalm, numbered more than 16,000 men, consisting of Frenchmen, Canadians, and Indians. But some were boys of 15, and others old men of 80. Here they awaited Wolfe, whose army numbered 9,000. By June the 21st, 1759, Wolfe's fleet lay at anchor in the north channel of the island of Orleans, not far below Quebec. Then began a time of trial and discouragement for the young commander, who vainly searched for a point from which he might hope to make a successful attack. In the meantime, his soldiers suffered from intense heat and drenching rains, resulting in much sickness. Wolfe, anxious with doubt, himself fell victim to a burning fever, but he refused to give up. He told his physician, "I know you cannot cure me, but please make me comfortable for a few days so that I can do my duty. That is all I want." Despite his pain, he went from tent to tent among his men, trying to encourage them. For several weeks, there was fighting in the vicinity of Quebec. On July the 31st, 1759, Wolfe's troops made a determined attack on the French on the heights just north of the Montmorency River. The English advanced heroically in the face of heavy rain, but were forced to retreat without gaining a foothold. And so the summer drew to a close, and Wolfe found himself in a desperate situation. He knew he needed to take bold action if he wanted to win the war, and so he made the decision to sail up the river, land above Quebec, and scale the steep and rugged cliffs there. His plan was to compel the French to fight a battle, or surrender the city. But scaling the cliffs was no easy feat. Wolfe searched for a way to do it, and finally he found a narrow path leading up the frowning heights not far from the town. He knew this was his chance, and he quickly decided to land his men there. With his plans in place, Wolfe set out to deceive the French. On September the 7th, the British embarked in gay red uniforms and sailed up and down the St. Lawrence as if looking for a landing place. It was all a ruse to conceal their real purpose. And on September the 12th, the fatal day for decisive action, some of the English vessels with a large body of troops on board hovered about the shore below Quebec as if to force a landing there. Montcalm was completely deceived. Meanwhile, the main body of English troops quietly anchored in the river above Quebec. 24 brave men volunteered as leaders to scale the cliffs. These men took their places in the foremost boat. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Wolfe gave the order to advance. It was a starlit night, but as there was no moon, it was dark enough to conceal the movements of the English. For 2 hours, the long procession of boats filled with soldiers floated silently down the river. The brave young Wolfe, calm and masterful, was in one of the foremost boats. He knew that he might not survive the coming battle, and so he had given the portrait of his betrothed, Miss Lowther, to an old school friend earlier in the evening. He said to his friend, "Give this to Miss Lowther if I am killed." As the boats floated downstream, the tension mounted. Wolfe knew that the fate of the war rested on his shoulders, but he was determined to succeed, no matter the cost.